Yeah, I'm Tom Ivy, executive producer at Armature Studio.
And Tom, thank you for joining us. Resident Evil 4 VR, easily one of the most standout VR experiences of 2021, and quite surprisingly so. I don't think anyone realized, just like you guys, were going to put the whole dang game into this experience. Like every single thing, where it's supposed to be, every single item, like where I remember it. And that is like how did you set out to like make that sort of one-to-one transition?
Well, yeah, we definitely, I mean, again, we knew we wanted to keep all the original like rooms and enemies and the boss encounters. And so really for the conversion to VR, it started with like more about how much could we convert into VR equivalents? Like, what were the core experiences that every player is going to want to do? They're going to obviously want guns and movement were the main ones, but also, just simple things like opening the doors and then it got to, okay, pushing buttons and levers. Then it got to what about the puzzles that are a bit more complicated. So we early on had a very a big list of everything that was in the game from an interaction standpoint. And that was more kind of where we were saying like, how far in the time that we have and the quality we want, can we push that? Like how many things are you going to be able to interact with, and do we have to kind of reform in our versions from the original game? So the puzzles are kind of an example of that, like red, green, light puzzle or whatever. Okay, well now that was just button presses. Now we need an actual stand, we need physical buttons on it, and how much are we kind of slightly changing the world while still keeping the puzzle, obviously. So from day one, it was like, we want everything in the main campaign in, and it was more just about how can we VRize it as much as possible.
How does the relationship come to Capcom? Do they come to you and say, hey, we like what you've done before with these Vita projects and other stuff, like can you make our old game a VR port? Or is it something that you bring to them and say, hey, look what we could do to your game if you want it in VR?
That was kind of interesting like a confluence of events, actually. Like we had been working with what's now Meta at the time, the Oculus subgroup inside there, and we had made 2 games with them before, Fail Factory and Sports Scramble, that were kind of more like arcade experiences. The Sports Scramble was, okay, let's take the next step, which was like going from a kind of static position game with just controller usage in Fail Factory, and now let's use like the full motion space for Sports Scramble, where you're like running around. So we had done a lot of, okay, you're holding bats and you're holding stuff. And so we had developed our kind of VR aesthetic, and they really liked working with us, and we loved working with them. So we had an availability coming after a Sports Scramble, like, okay, what are we going to work on next? And at the same time, they had been talking to Capcom about, hey, is there a franchise opportunity here where we can bring one of the popular franchises to VR? And so those just kind of hit at the same time. And we had experienced, a lot of the primary developers, myself included, had worked with Nintendo before, and Capcom and other things. We had a lot of development experience with Japanese studios. And so the fit was just very well. And so Capcom had seen what we had done and talked to the Oculus group, and it just kind of all happened at the same perfect timing, where we had this great relationship with both kind of studios. And so, and then choosing RE4 just felt like a kind of perfect fit. It's like, it was a very important game in terms of changing that action aesthetic and like bringing that one, and it fit very well with the VR aspect in terms of more gunplay, more action, while still keeping the puzzle aspect. So it just kind of was a perfect fit at the perfect time. We lucked out a lot, I think.
In the original games, you have the ready the weapon button and the fire button, and you can't be too creative with that. Were you ever worried that you were getting too far away from the original by offering such freedom?
Well, we talked about that a lot when we were doing the first prototypes, which were just kind of like recreating the village in the tools, not using any of the old code, but just saying, okay, let's get the camera how we want it to, let's get the movement, let's get examples of guns to show that we can do this with our copy of like the village map, right? The opening village map of the fight. And so in that's what we were discussing, was like, when you move, are you moving in third person? Are you just moving? Like, because a lot of times this was still like the transition of like, how much movement can people accept, and how much does that affect this game, which was, still a very tank style control back then, right? It's like the next step up. It was a massive shift in terms of what had been before it, but it was still like very like, you're getting yourself into a spot, then you're fighting, then maybe you're moving a little bit more, then you're fighting. And the conversion to just like run where you want, shoot, aim while you're moving, that was the biggest shift, more than like two-handedness, which was also discussion. So early on, we were kind of saying, how far do we go with this? And in the discussions with, Capcom and Oculus, it was always just like, well, what's fun? Like, right? This is, keep it Resident Evil 4, but like, if there's something where you're like, oh, is it exactly like that? Well, is it fun? Is it like interesting? Does it make the person feel like more excited about being in the world of Resident Evil? Does it, just emphasize or expand on something that was part of that universe? Then just do it. So they were very open in terms of like that thing of just like experiment, try it, and what was fun. So the movement getting down, and that is the biggest change, like the fact that you can move and fire in a way and aim behind you while you're moving. You're not like, turning toward a direction, moving and doing that stuff. That was the biggest game change. And I think once we got past that, it was like, it opened up the world. So when we were talking about two-handed, fighting with two weapons at once, we were like, well, this might be a bit imbalanced. Let's just see how it works out, because it's cool. It's going to feel artificial if you can't just throw the gun into your hand, and you want to just be able to, you just want to do that when you're in VR. So let's just see how it falls out. And then we made, minor adjustments and some major adjustments in terms of like, balancing. But to be honest with you, because you have to like mess with so many more controls, like you have to physically do the things that, reloading versus just pressing a button and funneling, when stuff's happening around you, that kind of balances the game out on its own, because you have more you have to pay attention to from a perspective that is more narrowed, because you were in third person shoulder before. So it had already added its own complexities that balanced out the fact that you could have two weapons or that you could move around. So the difficulty, we didn't change a ton or change a ton of AI behaviors to make up for the fact you could do much. It just kind of worked because of those extra things. But yeah, we had to do a lot of massaging after the fact.
Now, elaborating more on that, can you talk about like what exactly do you use from Capcom side in terms of like assets and code? Like, is this a game that you kind of fused with your own code and built on top of that? Do you build it from the ground up? Are you able to use models and textures from the game and put them into your game, or does all that stuff have to be remade?
Yeah, I mean, from a texture standpoint, we redid everything. Like, they had to be up-res. They just, we were coming from the original GameCube source, right? We wanted to have the definitive source, right? And those assets are just not at resolution, like, because we had those by default. That's what would show up on our models by default.
Lots of jagged edges on the GameCube.
You could tell that, okay, because it's a great looking game and it still looks great. It's so wild in third person, right, Cameron? But once you're in first person, you can go right up to something. It just doesn't stand up. It wasn't made to look at that angle. So we had to up-res like 4x, 6x, sometimes 8x, some 10x. Like it just really depended on how close and how big the piece was. And so we did all that. There isn't a texture that survives pretty much. And then the models, though, we kept the models. Like the way that the model and the rigging and the animation works, we weren't modifying animations, right? We were using the exact animations, the exact models. We had to tweak some skinning and stuff like that, but it's like, those are the models, right? And the world, from a geometry standpoint, we started with their exact models, and we were cleaning up a lot of stuff that you just couldn't see in the original game, like because you couldn't put your head over here, or was okay to be a flat, 2D plane in the old game because of the perspective. But when you're in 3D, you can just go, oh, that's just flat. Like you can tell that things are flat. So we made a lot of, carded models into full models and cleaned up a ton. I mean, there was a lot of work when you can see everywhere, basically. But yeah, I mean, so it started, but it was always like, look back at the original source. That is your guideline of what the world should feel like. Now make it feel like that in RE4. And so we had the direction of always like, it should look like you remembered it. Like if you compare the two games side by side, they're vastly different because lighting needs, fog, just everything of how the depth is expressed in VR is just, you can't just go one-to-one. Like if you use that color palette, it looks very flat in 3D. So everything from like slightly pumping up some colors and giving a bigger color range and changing the fog, there was a lot of changes to it, but it's all sourced from that thing. We are like painstakingly looking at those textures to try and match the content where it makes sense. And then on top of that, we are running the code of the original game, right? The enemies move because that's the way the enemies moved in the original game. It is that code. And then we stack on top our code that handles our guns, our versions of the interactions, our pulling the levers, our menus communicate down that. So you use your gun, you load, or our gun, you load the clip, you fire it. Once it fires, that's their bullet flying through the air and saying this is how it interacts with this enemy. So that's kind of the level of how it thinks. So it's kind of a piecemeal where you work on that. But that means that we're very true to the original game in that way, although there's obviously things that you have to, you know, modify when you're like running at a much higher frame rate to make sure that things are frame perfect and stuff like that.
I think TJ mentioned like he throwing a gun up in the air, reloading, and then catching said gun, and then like feeling like a
obviously you couldn't do that in the original, right? So that was but that was important to us. We were like, you should, when you throw it up in the air, like with Leon, Leon would be able to just like socket it perfectly in this thing. So some of our things are a little bit loose or a little bit more arcadey. We're not like, you know, you have to we allow you to auto reload if you want to, but you have reload, you cock your weapons and stuff like that, because we wanted it to have the, you know, RE4 is a realistic game, right? It's wild, obviously, but it's like, it's a world. It's a world where real things happen. And so we wanted it to feel that way, but we didn't want to be a sim, right? We wanted it to be empowering. You want to feel like cool Leon all the time. So it should be easy to, you're not perfectly slotting a thing. You push it near it and it, you know, clips in. Right?
Can I say how much I appreciate, like, there are so many VR shooters out there where once you choose your dominant hand, the gun or the firearm magnetizes to that hand. Can I say how much I appreciate the fact that you can actually like toss the gun back and forth between your right?
It's a simple thing, right? But it's just fun, right? And we wanted to do that on everything. There was a lot of small things like that we wanted to make sure was just, is it just fun to just hold forget the world of RE4 and whether we're accurate and, you know, like we're getting that down. First, let's just make it fun to manipulate the guns and do that. Now let's wrap everything important and awesome about RE4. That's the next stage. But if it doesn't feel good to manipulate the basic way of interacting with the game, it doesn't matter if you have a great franchise. You failed because you didn't make it fun to play in that franchise. So it was vastly important that we didn't ruin the RE4 experience by making a really sticky, you know, like stodgy kind of interaction to it. So I'm thank you for saying that. It was a lot of work, but they did a great job doing it. So and it was hyper important to everybody.
I'd have to agree. Like a huge part of like what makes this game feel so good to me and to many others is that like the interactions with every single weapon are so, I mean, like they weren't there in the original. You don't have a bolt to actually pull back and then put back in on the hunting rifle in the original. You don't have like oh, my favorite is the revolver. Like the way that you actually like have the moon clip and then you straight up just flick it up and it's ready to go.
Yeah,
it's so stylish like that. And like there's so much tactile feedback that feels good in it. And it's like how hard was it to like get that feel down to make sure that feel was satisfying when you were handling like the reloading, the fire,
that weight, the weight.
Yeah, a lot of it happens over time too. Like you get in your first version, you think, oh, that's really good, we did a good job, oh, great us. But then it's like the 95. We always talk about the 5%, the last 5%, right? Of like that takes 95% of your time to do the last 5%, right? To really polish it. And again, Mark Pacini, the creative director, and myself and some other members all come from like a heavy background at Retro Studios working with Nintendo, where it was like, that's what the polish is about, right? Like it is about hyper polishing. You're not scrambling just to finish the game. We make sure that there's time in our schedule to polish these things and to make sure that we're like not desperately finishing, but that we're time to polish. So, and he is that person in terms of making sure, you know, as a producer, sometimes I'm like, oh boy, do we have time to be looking at this minor little thing? And it's like, no, it's important, right? It's like those little things add up. You might not even understand what all is attributing to like your feel, but there's a lot there that you subconsciously take in and makes the experience feel good. And again, it was really important. This game is very important to us, like RE4. Like we want to make sure that we treat it well, right? And that's even to like, that even goes to like the accessibility options, like making sure that a lot of people can play it in a lot of different styles, and a lot of options in order how you approach it to, you know, whether that's from like comfort and movement stuff to handling the guns as well, right? How complicated do you want it to be, and so you can play it.
You do a lot of you've done a lot of ports in the past, and usually when you port a game, it's to something like it's on something a beast like PC machine.
Yeah.
You have to funnel it down to Nintendo Switch, or in your case, the Vita, or even mobile. When you're going from a GameCube version of a game to Oculus, that's a step up, right? Is it more difficult to go that way? Is it easier?
Well, again, like, yeah, we, porting games like Bayonetta or whatever, like you say, we're going from a PC version to say, like, how can we magnify? The Quest is a nice piece of hardware. People say, we saw out there where it would be like, oh, it's a GameCube game, like how hard it is. We're running like at a frame rate that it's never run at for it, doing it for both eyes, which is, there's double every cost that you have, you're doubling, right? And the GameCube was very, very good at doing transparencies. So the game was built on transparencies. Like the GameCube is just excellent at doing that, right? And a lot of modern hardware doesn't focus on that. It focuses on the number of, polys you can push, right? So again, adapting it in a clever way. But like the Quest is kind of a dream to work with. I was very new to working with VR hardware. Like I came on mostly on this project that the team had worked on the previous two projects that we talked about. But working with it, and again, working with Oculus on it was like, it was very nice. So it's like, we didn't run into a ton of places where we made capitulations. You're like, how do we want it to look, right? It was more about modding it for VR, and your presentation more than modding it, like, because we, did something. So it was always finding, like, how do we express fog in a way that is not like a million planes, in front of your face, right? How do we, again, adjust the lighting and the feel of the geometry to make it look less flat in VR? Because, the color palette of a lot of areas in the original Resident Evil 4 is very muted. So we wanted to keep that. You don't want to make it like this crazy colorful game, but how do you push it a little bit so you have depth feeling? So it's interesting because, like, you are pushing a lot of pixels with a lot of manipulations on them at a very high frame rate. So it was definitely a challenge in that respect. But again, like, I was way more worried about it than it turned out that it was necessary, just because it's actually a good piece of hardware for it.
As far as comfort goes, like, what was the priority when it came to comfort and building out that suite when it came to this game?
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot, and we've added more since. We had a patch that added a lot more options in terms of, more left-handed stuff, more changing the positions of things on your body. Our main focus, obviously, and the first thing you're always talking about is movement. It's like the thing that most people have problems with if they have a problem in VR is, like, especially with free movement, like in our game, where you can be strafing, and the feeling of how does the joystick, when you press it, what's the speed up? How does it speed up? What's the reaction time? How do you slow down? How do you shift? It's all that strafing stuff that, your inner ear problems, basically, where you expect it to be moving this way and it feels like a lurch that I'm falling, right? So a lot of it was centered around that, with teleport options and making sure our teleport was very robust and, like, you could play the game this way. But it's not like a game that was built off that concept, right? You can't let Leon teleport from one location to another location as if nothing happened. So we are actually fast forwarding the game when that happens. So everybody's moving with you. So it's a bit kind of like a strategic game. Like, I'm trying to mock there. If I teleport to there, that means this guy's going to be moving. He could catch me halfway through the movement, basically. So it's kind of this weird, interesting strategic game. It's not just like I can teleport 15 feet away from this guy immediately and be safe, right? So it still keeps that up. But yeah, teleport was the major aspect of that. And then it was like, yes, like, for example, reloading. If you pick a clip out by default, if you pick a clip out of your ammo counter, we automatically pop the clip for you, because the act of just doing a lot of button manipulation and stuff like that for some people is very difficult. And again, we weren't being a sim, but we've added that option, where you can turn all that stuff very simmy, like, you got to pop this, you got to do this, whatever. But then it was like kind of just making sure that things were loose, right? Like, you don't have to perfectly grab your grenade. It'll suck into your hand, so you have room around your body to be, you don't have to be perfectly aligned to our, flesh. And we had a lot of testing on that with a lot of different people at our studio and FQA testing to make sure that things were comfortable where you reached to, where you went to, or whatever. So it kind of all added up. And then like, also just things like what does the laser sight look like, and color options, and can you tell this or whatever. It all centers around that movement, but we added a ton more stuff just to make sure that every beat is like are we going to simmy? Okay, let's maybe make an option. What should be the default? And finding the middle ground for that default, while still letting people go like crazy simmy and like full fast turns and all that stuff, that is a lot for each person.
I think one of the things that terrified me most when I first approached this game was like, oh god, how is the boat going to work? Like the idea of being jerked around by that monster and like my vision turning extremely quickly just
for sure
made me queasy at the very thought. And then when I got there, like there was options very specifically for the boat, and it turned it into actually a comfortable experience that I never felt like I needed to take the headset off for.
That was a case where, again, you're not directly controlling. Like, it's one thing if we get wrong about how fast when you press your thumb forward it should go into the motion and that, but this is something you don't even control. You're being pulled around by something, and left and right. So we did a lot of work on that, not just from the presentation of saying like you can play in this mode or you can play in third person, but the way that Delago, the lake creature, moves and how much he shifts. We changed some of that behavior. We changed when he does certain attacks that were like more likely to cause big jerks in your motion, so that if you are playing in like the hyper, like I can take motion sickness mode, because even like the most experienced motion sickness dev people that we had were like, in our early versions, were like, this is too much. I can't do this, and I can play anything. So it was a lot of work to smooth out, splines and do this here and make sure you choose these attacks properly, and clamp down on some of that stuff. But again, the point is, we don't want you to feel like we did any of that stuff when you're playing it. It feels like, oh, this is just how it was. It's just in first person now. So that was always the goal: is, are we straying too far away from how it felt originally? Okay, where's the median line between those two things?
And equally important, like I was worried that when I did Leon's melee attacks, like, oh god, is it gonna spin me when it does his roundhouse? But then, like you use this sort of VR theater at intermittent moments, whether it's for quick time events or whether it's for melee attacks. And how did you decide where to implement that sort of VR theater approach to the game?
That was a big conversation that happened very early on, and then was talked about all the way through the project of what situations do we need to show or want to show Leon in. Some of that was, we still want to show Leon doing cool spy moves. Like, we're not, when you jump out of a window for the first time, we could have just moved your character through the window and done it. But when it's breaking the window, we wanted to show the flip. After that, you'll just do the jump down on ledges and stuff like that. But like, we wanted to still show him do the cool things. And that was very important from all the parties in terms of saying that. The other one was just that comfort thing. Like, you could have had the player physically spin around. That would obviously be terrible. It would be nausea inducing and very bad. The alternate thing though is like, you could have some kind of you stay thing, but a leg comes up, and it's just like, that's just gonna not look great for the moves that Leon does. He does very stylized kicks, and other characters, like when you're playing Ashley or the other characters are interacting with you, there's certain things that just like will not work, and we're not making the game from scratch. So we are working within the realm of how these creatures are supposed to move and react, right? So we don't want to break that. So we have to find this middle ground. And so the middle ground was saying like, hey, there are times where we just kind of move you out of the body, and you see yourself and you move yourself back in. And finding what we do those for and what we don't do those for. Like when you mantle over a window, which you do a lot, we don't do it for it because it's movement, it's a small move and it's not cool or something. But when you need to react or shake off a zombie, okay, well, you need to react already, and he's going to be in your face, and a lot of different guys can be coming at you. So being in the first person is just not going to make sense for it. And we don't want to change the fact that zombies grab you in this way and do these attacks, because that's Resident Evil, right? So yeah, it was always a conversation about how we have where we did each thing, and hopefully we came down on the right side of things, and it's still fun, right?